You're very welcome to the next episode in our Work From Anywhere series. Work is not a place. That is going to be today's topic, where we've got Laurel Ferrer, we've got Nick Levine and Sandra Panera. Wonderful lineup, mixture of real estate experts and remote work experts. Next week we've got another fantastic lineup as well. We've got one of the leading remote work professors in the world, Prithviraj Chaudhuri. We've also got Ben Stewart of Remote and Gonzalo Hall of Remote Work Portugal. So another fantastic lineup. Great to have you join us. We'll be on next Thursday and look forward to seeing you then. Hi everyone, you're very welcome to the next episode in our Work From Anywhere series. Home is where the heart is. We've all heard that saying before, but guess what? For many managers, it's the office is where the heart is. But we're seeing a lot of pushback against that over the last couple of months. What we're seeing is big movements in the last week, two big ones. First of all, we've had Cisco. Cisco have decided to let individual teams to decide about remote work, giving them the flexibility. Google, well, they approved over 85% of the remote work requests, of which there was over 10,000. But what's quite interesting there is there have been some challenges around that, for example, pay adjustments, with pay adjustments of up to 25%. In any case, it's the perfect moment to discuss work is not a place. We've got a great group of panelists here, which we're bringing on. And I'd like to introduce you to, first of all, thank you all for coming on board our Work From Anywhere series today. Maybe Nick, would you like to kick us off? Give us a bit of a background to yourself, a little bit of an intro.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having me, John. I really appreciate it. Great to be on with Sandra and Laurel as well. Great panel here. So Nick Levine, I'm director at Incendium Consulting, which is the consulting arm of the Instant Group, which is a workplace and workspace innovation company that's really focused on agility at its core, right? We are not a traditional service provider. We provide access to an agile, flexible office market, as well as solutions to deliver turnkey and fully managed solutions as well. And my focus here is to kind of be more upstream in the conversation with our clients to really understand why. What is the role of space going forward? And how do you design a work experience that ticks all of the boxes of how your people need to work wherever they are, and then make sure that that physical space is well suited to the environment that you need to facilitate whatever you want in physical space when you bring people together.
Great, thanks very much, Nick. So real strong on the property side of it. That's also the case as well for Sandra. Sandra, tell us more about yourself. You're in Realogics on the work.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity, John, and again, with Nick and with Laurel. I am the Director of Workplace Insights and Strategy at Realogics. Realogics is a Canadian company based in Ottawa. Our focus is actually on corporate real estate, data analytics, and insights. We also provide proprietary sensors where we can actually monitor and advise companies how they are using their space. So as they think about the future requirements for their offices, we can help them through the data understand what the requirements are going to be.
Excellent. So very strong on the workplace and different data points that you get around the actual physical workplace. Laurel, you're an expert on the remote work side. You consult a lot of companies with Distribute. You're also the closing speaker at the recent GitLab conference. So again, massive appreciation to all of you for being part of this. But tell us more about yourself and Distribute.
Yes, so I've been working remotely for about 15 years and building and managing and operating virtual businesses for that amount of time. And so this is a world that I'm very familiar with and very, very happy to be helping as many individuals and companies understand how to embrace this hybridity as well as virtual world as their new normal. So yes, like you said, I am the CEO and founder of Distribute, which is a consulting firm specializing exclusively in remote work and virtual organizational development. So it's been a busy year for us.
So if we take all that on board, a great mix. If we look at the topic of today, work is not a place. I'd like to ask you all, what do you think about that? I mean, if I look at it, I see it that we're in many ways a once in 100-year moment for property. I used to work in construction myself in my previous career. And there's so much going on right now. The shift in how we see cities, how we live in cities, the shift from commercial to residential, the variabilization of property costs with all this increased flexibility that's going on. I mean, how do you see all of this? What does it mean for the future of property and, for the future of humankind? Maybe Laurel, you might take us off on that.
Absolutely. I'll start on a pretty macro level and then let Nick and Sandra really zoom into a more micro level, because obviously they're the real estate experts and I don't want to venture into territory that isn't my expertise. But a lot of work that we've done at Distribute is relating to socioeconomics. So we leverage virtual jobs to solve larger problems like economic development or diversity and inclusion of a local population, or environmental sustainability. And that's something that we really need and want to recognize as a society, is how much impact this is going to have on our entire lives as individuals, as communities. This is really updating and really touching everything that we know about daily life, how infrastructures are built, how businesses are recruited to a certain area, where water is piped to and where it's not. Like, this has absolute significant impact and really opens the door to solve so many of the problems that we have needed and wanted to solve as a global society for a long time. I mean, a lot of us probably saw that UN report this week about environmental sustainability. Guess what is a great solution for reducing carbon emissions? And talking about minimizing the rural divide and getting more equal access to sustainable employment in declining economies and in rural areas. Like this, it can be a solution for so many problems. We just have to learn how to embrace it in a more sustainable and responsible way. But I'm excited to hear from Nick or Sandra about the more micro real estate side. Like, what does this mean for office spaces specifically?
Yeah, sure. I can talk to that a little bit. So, our stance is that we're still in a bit of a wait and see mode here. This is a once in 100-year event that people are responding to in real time and trying to understand how this is going to impact the way that their people work, the way that their organizations work. And there's been some initial indicators that show that there's movement in different directions in material ways. So one point that we've seen over the last year or so is that demand has actually for flexible office has increased in secondary cities and in suburban markets. So for example, Denver and Austin have seen increases in demand around 20%, whereas Chicago and San Francisco saw decreases in demand around 10%. And then in the suburban markets, for example, in New York, the CBD of Manhattan and the CBDs of Brooklyn saw a decrease in demand around 15%, but commuter cities like New Rochelle saw an increase around 250%. So massive demand changes in the way that people are looking to consume space. Now, that's just one indicator of what we think people are going to continue to do. However, as we get back to a more sense of normalcy around the virus, it'll be interesting to see how people either revert to their old ways of commuting patterns or thinking about cities in different ways. Now, my personal opinion is that I don't think there's any going back. We have seen a new way of working. In all reality, we've all kind of worked in this way in little bite-sized places for a long time. But now we've been forced into this new environment where we have readjusted the way that we think about work and what the role of individual versus team versus remote versus in-office work. It's going to be really interesting how that all plays out. But some clear indications that there is movement in different markets.
So really, I see really kind of a sense of a structural shift. I mean, you both touched on some fascinating points there. You mentioned, one of the things you mentioned, Laurel, was on the rural, let's say, divide, reducing that. We're seeing that in Ireland as well. There's some small towns that have had a real tough time of it as Ireland moved from, let's say, a rural economy to more kind of a services-based economy. But as a result, a lot of migration out of those small towns. But that's an opportunity to reverse that trend, which will be very interesting in countries like Ireland and in numbers. I mean, 250%, just incredible. So how do you see it, Sandra, from your standpoint? How are you, what kind of numbers are you seeing, or what kind of trends are you seeing?
Yeah, so being on the inside, what we're seeing is that right now there definitely is a ramp up with people coming back to the office, but we're seeing, generally speaking, that we're still under 20%. So that's kind of the number that we're seeing across most industries, across the world. There really isn't, you've got some regions that are higher, but generally speaking, they're around 20 to 30%. What we're also seeing is the people who used to be in the office the most before the pandemic are the ones that are coming back, but at significantly lower rates. The other thing that's interesting is the amount of time that people are spending in the office has reduced. So where before people used to come in and stay in the office for the entire day, what we're seeing now is people coming in a little bit earlier, but not necessarily staying for the full, 7 or 8 hour day. And then lastly, the spaces that they're using are changing. So where before, if you were in an environment where your seats were assigned to the employees, and even now coming back, because maybe they haven't really fully adopted flexible work just yet, the spaces that people are using, people are gravitating more towards the collaboration spaces, the open sort of lounges and kind of those spaces. And that sort of alludes to the fact that people want more elbow room and not necessarily coming in to sit at their desk to work over the course of the day.
Well, you mentioned a very important point there, Sandra. You mentioned how people that are going back into the office, they're not actually there for the full day. And I'm trying to think that through. The driver of that, is that because people are just popping in just to go for a meeting for an hour or two and then going back home to their remote work, let's say work from home workspace? Or is that more to do with just general workplace flexibility, that people who are going back into the office are just going in for a couple of hours and going in and out as they want to, and really mixing this hybrid work from home, work from the office?
Yeah, we don't really have data on that just yet, but I think it's a combination of both, right? So people will specifically choose to go to the office to meet up with colleagues and teammates or whatever, specifically for a meeting. In other instances, there may be specific functions that they need to do. For example, you've got people who need to access large format printing or other types of equipment that you don't necessarily have access to at home. And so you'll make the trek to the office to do those few things that you can't do at home, and then leave and come back. So there's a couple of things that's probably driving it. Number one is probably avoiding the commute and the traffic, right? Is that if you can leave the office a couple of hours early and get home and finish your day, it kind of beats the rush hour where everybody was leaving at 4 or 5 o'clock or whatever the case might be. So I think there's a number of drivers in terms of why people are not staying for the full day. And then the other part is maybe also just the fact that, if colleagues are working remotely, or some colleagues are working remotely or hybrid in a hybrid fashion, again, you're going into the office for a very, very specific reason. And so you're not staying there if the general population is actually working from home, because you can do that. You can communicate with your colleagues virtually from home.
Mm-hmm. I'll validate that actually with the data that we have here at Distribute, is that 30-hour work weeks become increasingly common for people that adopt location relevant models or virtual organizational models. Because, we've heard that statistic so much about how remote teams can increase their productivity by 40% and can increase output by 4.4% and great statistics like that. But a lot of people think that that's just because of distractions and working environment, and it's not. It's because of how virtual teams interact, and the increase in asynchronous communication increases the speed of efficiency. And so we deal with that all the time when dealing with hybrid teams, that we put this location irrelevant model into their operational systems. And then a few months later, they say, people are bored. Like, we're meeting all of our goals. Is a 30-hour work week possible for us? And we're like, yes, it is. Let's have the next phase of the conversation.
It's precisely that asynchronous communication. That's a real strategic cultural shift. That's a difficult thing to shift in a culture, though. I mean,
it is.
What are you seeing with the key to success from that, Laurel? I mean, and also one of the things you mentioned before as well, linked to that, is that hybrid is the most high-risk hybrid. 2 points, what are you seeing from the leaders, the best companies in this space? How are they managing asynchronous communication? How are they managing that hybrid model, let's say, that is such a high risk, high reward?
What we want to avoid at all costs is the mentality of some people are going back to the office and some people are staying remote. Just that language in and of itself is going to be the crux and the barrier to the success of the team, because there is no going back to the office. If you have a remote team member, you are a remote team. Period. So we really need to operate all as equally as possible and all have the mindset that we are all virtual workers, not necessarily remote workers and on-site workers, but we're all virtual professionals. And so the more that we use the same systems, the same models, the same tools, the more that that employee experience will balance out as much as possible. So that's really what we want to get to as a society and as an organization, because that will prevent those infamous case studies of IBM and Yahoo that had to retract all of their policies in the 80s and 90s because some people were on site, some people were not, and that imbalance eventually led to discrimination and lawsuits. So thinking of all of us equally as location irrelevant workers, that work is something that we do, not somewhere that we go, right? Work is not a place. That's the goal.
What would you say in terms of the best companies in this space that you've seen that are really kind of forging a path ahead?
You know, any company that really is doing well is those companies that are leaning on asynchronous communication, like we just mentioned, right? They are leading their teams away from the mentality that teamwork is together. And that's not the case. Teamwork is sharing goals, sharing results, sharing information, and that can happen not necessarily at the same time. So when they unlock their mindset from we need to be in a meeting in order to work together, and they start sharing information instead, that's where we really unlock the success. So companies that have been doing this for a long time very successfully are companies like Automatic and GitHub and GitLab, Envision, Mural, Buffer. Like there's the remote work icons that we've all heard about. But then more recently, we see large corporations that are doing this really well. Companies like Vistaprint and Dropbox and Indeed are all embracing this mentality and ready to forge ahead in this new light and saying, okay, we didn't get this before, but now we do, and we're excited to try something new.
That's a good point. And I think, to be fair, many of our audience probably will be aware of this, but some won't. That the likes of, for example, GitHub, they've actually got open source documentation where they document a lot of their remote working practices, for example, for people to learn from. Then if you look at it, Nick, I guess this shift, you talk about this shift from property to people. Can you tell us more about this? How do you see this and from the incident perspective?
Yeah, and first, I agree with Laurel. I think that the tools are very important to facilitate the asynchronous work, and a lot of organizations are really far behind in that regard. They have adopted maybe Teams or other chat applications, and in this moment have adopted the virtual video conferencing, but before that really didn't employ that at all. And so there is this huge evolution that has been forced upon these organizations that there's a lot of challenges around adopting that. And what I see from that is that's a big barrier for them to open up their ideas to new ways of designing their workplaces and so forth. So I think that's a really good point, Laurel. And there's a lot of work out there for your organization to help companies get there. And I see it across the board. So, commend you for doing that work. But when we say property to people, we're really talking about a power dynamic shift from work not being a place, right? That's the name of this title here. But place is still plays a role in work. And so in the past, if you look at the way work was done, we had these physical tethers to a desk, to a piece of manufacturing equipment, whatever it might have been. The role of work as a place was very specific and intentional because it was what was required. And now, as we've gotten mobile technologies that have freed us from those tethers, we've shifted in this direction at speed for a very long time. Right. This is 10 years in the making. And those of us who've been working in the field of workplace strategy or workplace analytics have seen the mobility and movement. I mean, the worst kept secret in workplace strategy is that even prior to the pandemic, occupancy in a typical corporate office was less than 60% on any given day. And the desk was probably occupied less than 40%. And so there's internal mobility, external mobility, which has bred freedom and choice and movement, which now are starting to flow through in very absolute terms around how companies are starting to think about the role of the office. What is the role of place going forward for us as an organization? We want to be more intentional. We want to have place play this role that is very specific in trying to drive interactions that often lead to trust, engagement, cultural connectivity, collaboration, this is the role of place going forward. And so when we say property to people, people are going to make the choice on where they want to work for the task at hand, but place is going to play a specific role, and the best properties are going to be positioned to drive the highest level of experience and the highest level of collaboration and intentional connections between people.
Intentional connections between people. I love that concept of untethering ourselves from the concept of one rigid place. That's certainly something that is exploding right now, and people changing their mindset. But then speaking of mindset and, for example, analytics, you're director of workplace insights, Sandra. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us on what kind of insights would surprise us that you've seen over the last couple of months in the last year or two?
I think generally that I don't know if there's anything that's really surprising. As Nick pointed out, is people who've been in the space know that people were not using, in the workplace strategy space, know that people were not using offices the way that a lot of people assume that they were using space. So really, it's just kind of really sort of formalizing what we've already known, right? So like the conversation of workplace flexibility has been around for many, many years. And, companies have not necessarily jumped to adopt it for, whatever reason. And it could be because the technology wasn't quite there and there was, different types of limitations. But as companies have become much more global in nature, the accessibility to talent, the accessibility to knowledge, you've got all kinds of learning platforms that are available where, things that you used to do in person, you can now do online. And so, as I said, I don't think that there's really anything that's kind of an aha with respect to what we're seeing from an analytics point of view. It's really just pretty much more of the same, other than just this significant reduction. I think what's interesting too is as Nick was talking about the whole increase in demand for flexible workspace is, obviously the realization that not everybody is going to want to work from home all the time. And so having options and having the ability to be able to tap into these additional places to work from, I think is going to be increasingly important. So while you're seeing a significant reduction in demand for branded workspace, you may see an uptick in sort of more of the flexible workspace or that on-demand workspace where people want to get out of their house and sort of go and socialize, and they want to have the ability to choose where they're going to do that. It's not necessarily going to be the corporate headquarters. It might not even be a co-working space. It could be a local cafe or a hotel lobby or spaces like that.
We've seen examples, to be fair, of companies that actually don't even have a head office anymore. And you mentioned, the increase, or even just going coffee shops. I mean, that taps into this whole variabilization of the cost base. Property is one of the biggest costs for companies in general. And if you can variabilize that according to demand, going back to Nick's point, that even pre-pandemic, 60% of offices were 60% occupancy rates. All of a sudden, that unleashes a whole bunch of other resources that can be transferred from, let's say, the property towards people, training people up, and investing in training, things like that, for example.
Yeah.
But I think it is fascinating, this whole concept of location irrelevant organizations as well, linked to that, Laurel. That was something you'd mentioned before, and it also taps into the point that Sandra's been making as well. Can you tell us more about this concept of location irrelevant organizations? What are they and what do they mean?
That's exactly what I was going to +1 about what Sandra just said. I'm like, this is so important to drive home for all of us that are in this workplace conversation, is the more that we polarize it and say, okay, who's going to work on site and who's going to work off site? Like, that's just creating more of the same problem. We really need to understand that when we're talking about people over places, there is a lot more diversity in people than there are in places. Everybody's going to have a different schedule. They're going to have different peak times of their productivity. Everybody's going to work better in different environments. So we really need to focus more on the flexibility than the choice of where are you going to permanently work from this point forward, because that was the problem, is that we were all working in the same environment. We were all choosing a permanent environment. And so that's something that a myth that I have to bust quite often about remote workers is they're like, oh, you're just hermits and you never see anybody for the rest of your life. And it's like, no. No, we travel a lot. Airports are very, very important to infrastructure accessibility for remote workers, because we travel a lot to get together for sprints with our teams, or we are moving to different locations. Sometimes I'll work from my home office. Sometimes I'll work from a different place in my home. Sometimes I go to a co-working space. Sometimes I go to my clients. Like, it's the flexibility that's appealing to people, not that I get to work from home from this point forward. And that's something that we'll see more of in the future as normal continues to emerge, because that hasn't been an option. That's why people are feeling so isolated and so locked down, is because they literally are locked down. We haven't had any flexibility. So the more that people have more access to flexibility, especially after being in the same space for a year and a half, they will want to come and go and have the option to come and go to the workplace, to co-working spaces, and to meetups with their team members a lot more. So that's something that we're seeing as a really high priority for the workplaces. Yes, that hoteling or hot desking model that Sandra was talking about, as well as just, it doesn't matter when I'm here. I'm not going to be punished or thought that I'm not productive if I show up at 2 and leave at 5 or something like that. Like, my productivity is visible and measurable in this location irrelevant way. So the location irrelevancy, to come back to your point, is all about that we can be productive and measured and valued equally no matter where we are. Whether we're 5 feet away from each other, 5 continents away from each other, we are a team member, and we are a team, and we can show our productivity and our results equally.
It's absolutely critical. I totally agree with you, Laurel. You have to remove the expectation of presence as a measure of productivity and put everybody on the equal footing to be able to measure outcomes and what they're working on, and measuring whether or not they're being effective, independent of where they are. The role of place is really interesting in that there's this like emerging workplace ecosystem that is tied together by technology, all the collaborative tools that we're starting to use more effectively, but the spaces that we consume are going to vary completely across the board. And it's going to be a spectrum. There still will be 10+ year leases, because it makes sense for organizations to develop critical mass in specific geographies where they have lots of good talent and want to bring people together, all the way down to consuming a coffee shop, but even on-demand spaces. There's technology that's developing now that will allow people to consume space within the procurement rules of their organization, right? On-demand, liquid space, Upflex, Dasana, DeskPass, all of these organizations are emerging to make that type of work for these organizations, because organizations still need control over how their people are doing things and how they're measuring things, tax implications, right, John? All of these things come about, and they need to have the structures in place to allow that to happen. But there's this massive ecosystem that's developing there, and it's all based on empowering people to make the right choices and giving the structure to the organization to trust that they're following through in the right ways.
I'd like to, Sandra, do you want to come in on that as well? You've got some points to make on that, some really interesting discussion.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to just kind of add to what Laurel was saying about the fact that, people are very diverse. So one of the things that I think is fascinating about the line of work that we do is the ability to dig into the data. And we have the opportunity to look at not only, typical occupancy data, whether somebody is there or not, but to actually integrate with other data sources. So for example, we can integrate with HRIS data. And with that, what we're able to do is actually explore occupancy based on demographics data. So looking at who's coming into the office based on age, based on tenure, based on job function, based on their commuting distance, for example. How far do they live from the office, and what's their dependency on physical office space when you take those things into consideration? And it's interesting and even departments, for example. And I think what's interesting is when you hear conversations about certain job functions have to be in the office, because that's just legacy thinking. That's kind of the way it's always been done. A lot of these theories are disproved when you actually start to look at the data. And every company is different because obviously the makeup of their people is very different, but you do see similarities. So people who tend to live, for example, downtown, they're in smaller living quarters and therefore have a greater dependency on physical office space. As you progress through your career, the older you get, the more ingrained that you get in your job, the more comfortable you feel. You tend to have less of a dependency on office space. And that's consistent across every single organization. And so what it does is not only does occupancy data looking at the here and now allow you to understand how people are using space, but when you start to blend these other data points in with the occupancy and understanding what's actually transpiring, you can start to think about the futures to say, well, if certain demographics have a certain dependency on office space, and if we continue to hire people of similar personas, so to speak, then this is what we can expect in terms of how dependent they're going to be on physical office space. So it's really, really fascinating from that perspective as well.
And actually, what's also fascinating is the questions we're getting from the audience as well. I'm going to take us through. We have got, let's take a look. We've got Tyler, massive hi to Tyler. He's got a great podcast. Highly recommend. He's a big fan of Laurel, and we also had a +1 from Mark as well. Kieran was enjoying the discussion. Going through some of the questions that came through, or some of the remarks. We had Brent, and any of these, feel free if any of you want to jump in. One mega trend for recent history is the migration to mega cities. I firmly believe that work from anywhere, and I've lived this for almost 2 decades. But curious if cities will remain, but suburbs will become the dominant work environment. That's one question. If any of you want to take any of these.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So because of our economic development work, yes, we're definitely seeing this. So number one, we're seeing a much higher rise in rural environments than any of us anticipated. People are really hungry to really overcompensate the high pace of life of megacities like you're talking about, with just slowing way down and having that high pace environment at work, and then getting back to nature and really balancing that very virtual technical experience throughout their workday with very tactical activities, farming, gardening, construction. We're seeing a huge rise in those as hobbies. So it's really fascinating to watch that emerge. But yes, absolutely, the data validates this. Here in the United States, there was fascinating data that was released amidst the fleeing of urban environments from the United States Postal Service about where people changed all of their zip codes to, and rise of the rural was really the theme, and suburb environments. Yes. In the long term, we'll see suburbs probably become more popular than rural because of this exact workplace conversation that we're having. Most companies will promote a hybrid environment. There will still be some expectation for you to be in the office once or twice a week or once or twice a month. And so because of that, people will still need access to the office, but they can have a longer commuting distance than they did before because they don't have to make that commute daily. So yes, satellite areas to major cities are on the rise. I personally live in New England, right in between Boston and New York. And yes, our housing market is absolutely exploding. So not just the suburbs that we used to think of, the suburbs of daily access to the cities, but satellite environments in general, anywhere from 2 to 3 to 4 hours away from a major city will all see an increase in real estate.
Fascinating. I love the point about the U.S. Postal Service as well. Feel free if any of the rest of you want to jump in that question as well.
I'll just jump in. I wouldn't sleep on the mega cities, though. You know, the New York, London, Shanghai, these cities just have such gravitational pull. And, you know, there is still something about a culture of these spaces. I mean, there's a reason why Silicon Valley developed all of these entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs who have other entrepreneurs in their network are more likely to take the risks to build new businesses, and oftentimes are more successful because of the network around them. Now, in the past, our networks were physical, and in the future, they're going to be more digital. But having having met people before in person, you have a much better relationship, and when you interact with them in person, you're going to have more energy there. You know, one of the people on the line here, Mark Smuckler, I met him once. I feel like I have a much better relationship with him, other than just other people who I've only met online, right? So there's still something about being together with people, and these cities have that gravitational pull. And one little anecdote, and there might be some data that disputes this, but what I saw in New York moving during the pandemic, I missed the rent window, right? Rents dropped significantly. Unfortunately, my lease was longer, and I missed it because Gen Z just moved right in, right? Wow. They took all of the low rent options that they didn't have the availability before. And so New York just got a lot younger. And it wasn't necessarily, there was this massive migration of people who probably were going to move out in the next 5 years anyway, and the young people just moved in, and I missed the rent window, unfortunately.
But going on to that point again, it's a very important point, the transformation of, let's say, just the average age demographic in the mega cities. But how do you tap into the point, for example, of the shift from a lot of commercial use buildings to residential? That, you know, that's not a shift that can take place overnight. That's something that will take, 5, 10, 15 years of, for example, business districts of a city that now won't be anywhere near close to even 50% occupancy. They'll be used differently. So the offices themselves will need to change, but also parts of those districts will need to change to residential, I guess. Is that what you're seeing as well, or the rest of you also see?
Yeah, I actually think about this often because, like I said, I live in New England in the United States, and I'm repeatedly reminded of how often history repeats itself. So I'm surrounded by empty factories everywhere. There are tons and tons and tons of empty factories. And we just are sitting on those as a community, just like, here's this big empty building. But what happens if we embrace the fact that, yes, another industrial revolution has happened, and how can we repurpose that real estate? So I think that that's the lesson that we need to learn, is that this has happened many, many times in our societal history in the past, and what are we going to do now to embrace it and not make the same mistakes that we have again? So how can we repurpose our workplaces? Sandra's suggestions were spot on. Like, how do we bring new furniture in, new furniture configurations, new spaces, new technology? How do we make the most of what we currently have to meet the needs that are new?
I think the other piece that's interesting in all of this is, there's obviously a huge impact on communities, so that, as people sort of do move out into the suburbs and being able to live where we work, the whole concept of being able to interact with our neighbors or, local store owners and buy local and that kind of stuff to enable communities, in the suburbs to really thrive. I think brands have a really incredible opportunity to fully immerse themselves in communities where, previously maybe the focus was, branding their building, for example, is, well, imagine if they could invest in communities to help build the infrastructure. Because I think that's the big miss, right? Is that all the infrastructure is in the urban centers, like the downtown core. The whole concept of work has been built on people commuting to a central place. And in as much as there's this need for more flexibility, the hub and spoke conversation that we've had, those offices don't necessarily exist, within a decent commuting distance of where people live when they don't live in the urban city centers. And so it's a shame that you've got this huge concentration of facilities and locations in the downtown core, because you're still going to be requiring people to commute, which is what people have said they dislike the most about, working in an office. And you don't want to be building new construction in the suburbs. And so you have this challenge of, how do you deal with this excess space that you have downtown and this requirement where people want to be more proliferated in various communities where they live.
That's a very good point, and actually links to Sinead's question here. Does the panel envisage more working hubs being developed in suburban rural areas? And what I love about your answer there, Sandra, is you're actually saying, well, it's brands. It's an opportunity for brands to come in and not just plank a placard at the side of a building, but actually help maybe get a building kitted up for Wi-Fi, create a co-working space, things like that. So that's a very different approach to what you would have had before. Another question as well from Christy. Be interested in the panel's thoughts on the WeWork and Saks partnership happening in NYC and LA in the future. I have no idea this one, so I'll leave this one over to you guys.
I'd be happy to just jump in on that one. That was a really great real estate play by Saks to help diversify their offering and use some of the space that they had kind of sitting there, right? So retail has been going through a massive transformation. Big box stores have gotten on the more consumer retail side have gotten much smaller and more experiential, including Saks, very high touch, high experience. And so they were sitting there with a lot of extra space. And so this is a way for them to utilize that extra space, bring more foot traffic and have a brand alignment with WeWork that has, they've stumbled a bit recently, but they still have great brand and people love what the environments that they create. So it's a marriage between two brands that are trying to take advantage of a certain demographic and bring foot traffic to a high-end experiential space.
So kind of innovative deal, taking advantage of the current moment we're in and the different use of real estate. But speaking of real estate, I mean, there's been a lot of talk of people pushing back into the office in September, but obviously the Delta variant, Nick, has changed the picture there. I mean, how are you dealing with that? How are your clients responding to that, for example, at the moment? That's one that's kind of a bit of a challenge at the moment, huh?
Absolutely, yeah. You've seen announcements from Uber, Lyft, New York Times, pushing back their return to office dates or pushing them back indefinitely because there's a lot of uncertainty around how long this pandemic really will last. And what we're seeing from our clients, so first off, there's just so much uncertainty flat out. Only 7% of our clients who we surveyed have a concrete return to office strategy where they know exactly what they're going to do and how their environment is going to work. That's almost no one. Right. So everyone is still trying to figure this out. And at this point in time, there's going to be, in the past, we had this massive remote experiment, and now we're going to have a massive hybrid experiment. And there's going to be a lot of testing and learning and adapting on the fly. And that's why, organizations that have committed to a launch and learn and iterate philosophy are going to be set up for success going forward. Because right now, it's going to be really hard to make a big bet on what to do with your real estate. I think making investments in technology and the digital tools to facilitate the type of work, that's a fairly safe bet. But in terms of real estate, there's going to be a lot of testing and learning, which actually moves a lot of the demand into flexible office, which is just going to accelerate trends in terms of the adoption of flexible office and serviced offices to allow companies to be very agile right now, because it's super important for this moment in time. But understanding and getting a taste of the benefits of agility is only going to accelerate the development of that market, and you're going to see a supply growth on that side of the spectrum in a significant way because of that.
So again, tapping into the fact that with the likes of COVID and the Delta variant, probably making it even more structural and embedding this whole new way of working, I guess. Speaking of which, Sandra, what's your view? Is this a passing fad or a structural shift? I mean, one of the surveys that came out recently was by Qualtrics. To be fair, they'd have a bias towards this, I can imagine to a degree, but they had a survey that indicated 80% of people looking for a new job said it was important to them that their next job offered them the opportunity to work or live anywhere. So that aspect, is that something that's structural, or is that a passing fad?
No, I think that it is definitely the beginning of a shift. I think employers demanding that people be in the office 2 to 3 days a week. Interestingly enough, I was reading something a couple of days ago, and they were talking about how that kind of structure still or sort of lends itself to employers kind of wielding control over where people actually live, right? So kind of this idea of you have to be able to come into the office on demand, within an hour. And it's like, that never happens. Nobody ever says, hey, it's an all hands on deck. Everybody out there has to come into the office within the hour. So it's kind of
the ambulance sirens.
Yeah, exactly, right? But, as I said before, there's so many factors like commuting, the cost of housing, childcare, green space, and just kind of the general lifestyle that you want to live for yourself and even for your family, that dictating such requirements, just doesn't feel really people or human centric, right? It's kind of, it just doesn't feel right. The other thing too is that jobs aren't forever, right? So if you think back, in the past, our parents probably worked for one employer for most of their lives. the younger generations don't, right? We tend to change jobs every 3 to 5 years or whatever the case might be. And so, city living has certainly been about, being centrally located so that you can access these great places to work, but it's kind of backwards. I've questioned it for years, why offices centralize, their spaces downtown, forcing people to do that dreaded commute by transit or by car every day. It's really insanity. I'm not sure if it's going to mean that people will move to different countries yet. I think that's a bit of a leap way too far on the other side, that people probably aren't quite fully ready to adapt it. And even laws and, legislation and kind of taxation and all of those other things, they're not there yet. But that's not to say that it's something that, we can't do in the not too distant future. And so I think that it's a movement that's definitely has started, and it's just going to continue to unravel, and we're going to see what it's going to amount to probably in the next 5 to 10 years.
Sorry, go ahead, Laura.
Oh, I was just going to say, I completely agree. I think it's important to really extract the fact that those statistics that we're talking about, how 70 to 80 to 90% of workers want to keep working remotely, those are the exact same statistics that existed pre-COVID. So what's changing is not the workforce opinion. What's changing is the employer opinion and the employer accommodation of that.
And just one little wrinkle there. You mentioned it, Sandra, the global nature of this. Global organizations are challenged with work from anywhere outside of Western countries, right? The home conditions, the internet bandwidth, the infrastructure to do work outside of an office is just not possible in many locations across Asia, India, and others. So as organizations are starting to deploy work from anywhere, they have to be careful not to be too Western centric with their ideas and accommodate their workforce in the ways that they need to within the culture and the geographies that they're in. And the role of the office is still very strong in those areas that are still kind of coming up to our standard of living and the infrastructure that we enjoy here that have allowed us to be very comfortable in our home settings.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to add one more point. I think the point you make, Nick, about the fact that you've got these, differences in culture from a country to country perspective. I actually had a conversation with someone several months back about just even cultural differences in terms of expectations. So, with working from anywhere, working from home, being forced to as a result of the pandemic, before the pandemic, if you worked virtually, you weren't necessarily required to be on camera all day long. And now you are. And there are, certain religious backgrounds or cultures where, you can't be on camera. And so it's being very respectful of the differences just purely from a cultural perspective, in that sense that we're not all the same. So you take what's happening in an organization and now you expand it out to the world, and it just complicates the diversity that much more. And in as much as we say, technology is enabler of work from anywhere, really it's about a change in mindset, right? You can have all the technology in the world, but if you don't have the willingness to be open, it's not going to work.
My mind is buzzing. There's so many ideas you guys are after giving me. I mean, one of the ones on cultural differences, one of the things when you talk about work from anywhere internationally, that is, a lot of us have the bias in our mind that it's somebody from North America or from Western Europe that's going to the beach in Thailand. And that's certainly a part of it. Or traditional expats, that's work from anywhere as well, which is normally a small percentage of companies. But it's also, from a cultural perspective, the Indian expat working in the US, going back to India, be with their family for 2 or 3 months, or it could be the Eastern European expat working in Western Europe wants to go back to their family. They might have a sick parent, for example. And what's fascinating from a cultural modeling perspective and the data around this is that cultures that are typically very collectivistic, it's a very, very important benefit for them to be either relocate permanently back to where they live, let's say where they're from, or even spend a couple of months. I don't know. Again, Nick, you made a good point about the Wi-Fi and internet connectivity. It has to be of a certain level. Otherwise, it's just not going to work, is it? But you definitely have raised a couple of points there. There's another point here as well from Timothy. He had a question: has the panel any data, thoughts, or experiences on how employers in the new world are addressing traditional employee benefit provisions such as medical, dental, illness, and retirement savings, together with change in salaries, bonuses, and other rewards? Maybe, Laura, do you want to jump in on that? Seeing the whole work flexibility or work from anywhere as an employee benefit and how that's measured and how it's being tackled. How do you see that?
Yeah, the rule of thumb right now is to leave everything as it is. So many employers are saying, oh, well, you get this benefit, so we're going to take all of the other benefits away. And it's like, no, this isn't necessarily an employment benefit. This is a humanity benefit. This allows us to be more of our whole self and have less of a dichotomy between our professional lives and our personal lives. So, the employers that are withdrawing traditional employment benefits in favor of work from home benefits are still seeing the same attrition rates as if they were to take away work from home benefits. So it's really important that we keep the conversation going. We keep treating our employees as employees, but then we continue the conversation in that direction to say, we know that you are more than an employee and we want to accommodate that side of you as well. So that's where we start to see more of conversation about virtual culture benefits starting to emerge. So how can we support you in being a better remote worker as well? So benefits like co-working memberships, like we've talked about, benefits like we're going to send cleaning services to your home so that you are working in a clean and safe environment. Exercise routines, like a lot of companies will send their workforces Fitbits so that they can have Fitbit competitions and make sure that they're getting up and moving enough, because we all know how sedentary you can be as a remote worker. So yeah, things like that, where companies are starting to think about how can we support your health and wellness and all aspects of your health and wellness, your professional health and wellness, yes, your financial health and wellness, yes, but also emotional health, mental health, social health. How can we support all of the factors that make you great at your job?
I want to pick up on one point you made there, Laurel, around attrition. It's really interesting to see. I mean, John, we talked about this before. There's the Great Migration. We're hearing a lot about this, or the Great Resignation, whatever you want to call it. And there's a really interesting stat that came out from in the U.S. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that in May, 700,000 workers in the category of professional and business services, so traditional white collar workers, they quit their job. 700,000 people. That's the most in any 1 month on record. And
Wow.
so, part of it is pent up kind of movement that wasn't able to happen over the last year because people didn't feel confident. But certainly the job market is really, really good. And people are looking for flexibility. Workers, half of the workers surveyed under 40 said they would consider quitting if their employers won't let them work remotely at least some of the time. And so you're seeing this right now where companies are going to have to respond if they want to keep their top talent. The A players, they have to develop a strategy that promotes flexibility, promotes an equity among their population, no matter where they are, independent of place. Really important for organizations to get their arms around this right now.
So equity, fairness, but then there's also the sustainability point that had been mentioned by earlier as well. And Nick, you touched on it. This is a quote from Wade Foster, the CEO of Zapier. It says, "What if we redesigned what it's like to live based on how people are working?" That's a question posed by him. And they basically offset 647 tons of carbon through reforestation, including carbon footprint from, let's say, reducing the carbon footprint through home working. Could I ask all of you, how are you seeing that environmental and sustainability side? Because on the one hand, yes, you reduce basically the commute, for example, you're not in big offices, but then you have to heat individual houses, things like that, for example. But clearly there must be a benefit, I'm guessing, or how are you all seeing this? It's
a bit tricky, though. Sandra, you and I think we had a little debate on LinkedIn, or a bunch of people had in the comments section of one of your posts. And it's uncertain around where it's more efficient to perform different tasks. Yep. Now, if you're heating your entire home or cooling your entire home to sit there on Zoom in front of the computer all day, that might be less efficient than being in an office that is much more finely tuned for energy efficiency. I mean, one giant fan is more efficient than 10 little ones, always. And so as we are more distributed, we're going to have to think about this. Now, offices are still in place, and even if they're empty, they're still consuming a lot of electricity. So Sandra, maybe if you want to jump in, I know you posted about that this week around how these buildings are still consuming a lot of energy even though they're sitting empty.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of, has always been the debate, right? Is that the focus has been mostly on the commute, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and kind of at the employee level. But as Nick pointed out, it's true, these buildings do still sit there, vacant. And even if you hibernate a floor, there's still, certain basic functionality that has to continue to keep the building running. And so you're still going to have, the emissions that come from those buildings. And what I think is interesting is that, even as a shift from a company perspective, and I haven't really quite wrapped my head around this, but, with companies kind of choosing flexibility and allowing their employees to work from home, what you don't want is companies pushing the onus of sustainability onto their employees, right? And so, for example, in an office setting, if you have a formal recycling program, then that the building that you go to work follows that program through disposal and whatever. At home, the onus of responsibility is ultimately on the employee, and so the company no longer has visibility to that, and so they're going to report this massive reduction in waste. But is that really true, right? So you don't want it to be sort of an offset to say, hey, we're going to push the responsibility onto the employees and then, have our claim to fame because we've reduced our carbon emissions. But meanwhile, you've got 40,000 employees at home that who knows what they're doing from a sustainability, point of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's emerging frameworks around accounting for remote work. It's not quite there, but we're starting to see GHG protocol and their corporate framework on how you're accounting for these things. But a lot of this is going to come down to governance and accountability. Great point around putting the onus onto the individual. One of the stats that I loved over the last year or so is that in the peak of lockdowns, if you look at month over month comparisons on greenhouse gas emissions, it only dropped by 8%. Mm-hmm. And so when there was no travel, no commuting, a lot of the industries were shut down. What that tells us is that it all comes down to the grid. So companies need to be moving in the direction of buying renewable energy and pushing the demand onto the grid to decarbonize and have it be much more system oriented than just the individual.
Yeah, but when we're talking about environmental sustainability, we also need to consider physical waste as well. So yes, there's carbon emissions, but we're not buying paper clips, we're not buying copy paper, we're not, like by moving operations to a virtual model and digital tools, there's a lot of physical waste reduction.
Good point,
John. You got it. You're
I'm looking at the time here because this has just been such a fantastic discussion, so much energy, so many ideas from it. I'm going to have to ask you a closing question. You got 30 seconds each. Start with you, Nick. We've seen so much change in so little time to work from anywhere. What is the world for property going to look like in the next 10 years' time? And what are the second and third order effects we've got to watch out for? 30 seconds, go.
Yep. It's going to be all consumption based into the future. People are going to be consuming space on demand. Companies are going to have much more variability in how they're responding to that. And so the biggest second order effect is probably going to be on building valuations. Today, they're all based on a cap rate that's based on the 10-year lease of a high credit corporation. And that's what the investor cares about. It's going to be moving more towards a hospitality model that's more on a day rate, variable consumption, and the valuation of those buildings is going to change.
Fascinating. Sandra, you're taking that.
I think I concur with what Nick said. I think the other thing is that buildings will probably retain their presence purely for vanity reasons.
For vanity reasons. Fine. Mm-hmm. Second and third order effects we should be watching out for. Anything jumping out at you? And what about you, Laurel? What do you think? What are your thoughts?
Me? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Sandra, I'm so excited to hear your wisdom. I think that the economic infrastructures are going to be now more based on individual patterns as opposed to corporate patterns. So the economic development infrastructure and process in general, the traditional process, has now been reversed. Instead of really attracting businesses and then workers follow, it's now the opposite. So we're going to start to see culture match really being based on lifestyle. And why are people flocking to Denver and Austin? Because they've got great local cultures to offer outdoor recreation and music. And we're going to start seeing more of the same in other places. I love that.
Just ties in beautifully with Nick's point earlier and Sandra about, moving to shift from property to people. And it's actually people bringing businesses, right, and bringing property, vice versa. Yeah. I have to say thank you all so much. I wish we had another hour to discuss this.
So
we
do
could have
we,
probably talked for a
apparently.
couple of hours, but you've been so generous with your time, all of you. I think I've loved the answers. I hope the audience, hope you've enjoyed it too as well. You can tune in next Thursday for same time, and we'd love to catch up with you. We've got another great lineup. I'm going to say goodbye to all of you, but again, massive thank you all for being part of this.
Thanks, John.
Thanks,
Thank you.
John.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.